Our next guest will be a familiar one to readers of the Toronto Star, where he's had a very successful career for over 30 years. He's currently the newspaper's Ontario political columnist, but he's also served as foreign affairs editor and head of both the Middle East and Asian bureaus. That range of experience, together with the insights he brings to his columns, make Martin Reg Conn one of the most seasoned and respected journalists in Canada today.
But Martin has also touched the lives of many readers recently with a 6-part series documenting the harrowing experiences of his late mother, who escaped the Holocaust. We'll talk about that journey in a few moments, but first, welcome to Toronto Files, Martin.
Thank you.
And let's start by talking about your own career as a journalist. You started at the Star in the early 80s at Queen's Park, and then spent a number of years in, as Helen mentioned, in foreign bureaus. You became the foreign editor. You worked for a time in Ottawa covering national politics. And here you are now, back full circle at Queen's Park. Of all those postings, which was the one that appealed to you most?
Or maybe the two.
Or two.
Those are good questions. Two good questions. I would have to say that being a foreign correspondent is still the dream job. And while being a columnist is for many the most satisfying and the best avenue to really reach people in their lives, the most fun, I have to admit, was being overseas for obvious reasons. You are being paid to work, you are being paid to have fun as well, and you are able to travel and see parts of the world that you would never have imagined in a way that's quite different from visiting as a tourist, because you really are able to see at ground level and to interact with people in a way you wouldn't ordinarily.
Mm-hmm. So being in Jerusalem, being in parts of Asia, all of that, very exciting. But, you know, people who look at other countries often come back to Canada or re-look at Canada and say, this is really a peaceful, tolerant, wonderful society in place. Did it change your perspective on the country you now have returned to and call home?
Yes. That's almost a trick question, because I'm going to give you an answer that you might not have expected. On the one hand, absolutely, you come back and you kiss the ground when you reach Canada, Canadian soil again. It is a peaceful country, it's a democratic country, it's a prosperous country, it's amazingly multicultural, and it really hits you between the eyes when you step off the plane in other countries which are so homogenous for the most part. But you see parts of Canada that you actually don't really recognize when you live here. And one of them, I guess, is that we are, in many ways, a little bit passive, a little bit too buttoned down, a little bit too afraid to take risks, and sometimes a little bit too cautious about offending people. There is a bit of a terror here. I'm not going to get into the whole politically correct battle. It's not that I'm against or seeing political correctness in imaginary places. But there is definitely a bit of a tisking here that you sometimes don't find in other countries, where people are just more blunt. They say what they mean, or they say it in a different way, but they get to the point.
Let's talk about your experience at Queen's Park, because, as I mentioned, you started in the early 80s, in the latter days of the Bill Davis government, and then you had those years away, but came back, and you've been at Queen's Park through the McGuinty years and now with Kathleen Wynne. Have you seen a lot of change in all those years, or is public policy and government still the same old as it always has been?
Well, it's dramatically different, and it does seem like ancient history when you put it that way, going back to the 80s. Look, I'm often asked, why did you come back to Queen's Park after being in this sort of glamorous and exciting position overseas? One of the frustrations about foreign reporting, just to go back for a second, is that I often felt helpless about what I saw. I was able to chronicle it as a journalist. You would cover earthquakes, for example. People think of earthquakes as this great natural tragedy, but it's actually a man-made tragedy in many ways, because the buildings, the homes, the offices are not built properly. They're not built to code as they would be here, building code. And so thousands of people will die in Iran or Afghanistan in an earthquake, whereas only a handful of people will die in Japan or San Francisco when there's an earthquake, because the buildings are built properly. Yeah. So that always hit me as the imperative of sound public policy democracies where people actually can improve things rather than just rebuilding shoddy housing again and people knowing that people will die as they did in Pakistan, another earthquake. And I found this very depressing. Coming back to Queen's Park, for me, it actually was very satisfying. I didn't come back directly. I came back through the newsroom and being foreign editor and so on. But when this columnist job became available, it was for me an amazing opportunity to feel like I was more directly connected to people's lives. Also in the newsroom, when I came back from overseas, I was deputy city editor for a while, and that was amazingly satisfying, being able to oversee our municipal election coverage, for example, and what could be more hands-on than seeing a municipal election with the low turnout rates, but the opportunity to try to encourage people to be more involved. So at Queen's Park, as you both know, because you've both worked there, you have a level of government that is often underestimated, that people often, it's like the poor cousin of Ottawa with national defense and foreign affairs.
And yet
There's so much.
so many important issues are actually dealt with
I don't
there.
need to tell you
directly,
but for our viewers,
Yeah.
the fact is that's what controls hospitals, police,
Right.
schools, highways,
Hydro.
nuclear reactors and hydro,
yeah,
and your electricity bill.
all the most important things to the way we live.
Yes. So it's very connected to people's lives. And in that sense, that's an appreciation I didn't completely have as a young reporter when I wanted to see the world after a few years at Queen's Park. Coming back full circle, I actually feel like having seen the world, in many ways, the action is at the legislature.
And it really does matter. So let's talk about, you were there to cover the quite stunning victory of Kathleen Wynne in 2014 when she became leader of the party and then premier. How do you think she managed to overcome what were some pretty heavy issues hanging over her, the gas plans for one? How did she achieve that victory, and how do you think she's doing now?
And you're thinking about the provincial election, not the leadership campaign.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, sorry.
And
Because that was a surprise. She wasn't expected to win a majority.
Right.
And I want to, if you don't mind, I want to circle back later to the actual leadership, because she also overcame some barriers there.
Right. Yeah.
But in terms of the nitty-gritty politics of the 2014 election, I think the simplest answer would be that elections are not a referendum on Kathleen Wynne or Dalton McGuinty, or on Tim Hudak, the Conservative leader of the day, or Andrew Horwath, the NDP leader. Elections force people to make a choice between all three party leaders. And so as much as the opposition and sometimes the media try to frame it as a referendum, do you hate Dalton McGuinty or Kathleen Wynne? Do you like them? Did they screw up? Do they have all these boondoggles and scandals that are on their backs? Okay, maybe they do, but what about the other person? So I think voters at the end of the day, my impression at least, is that they actually have to make a choice between all three. And that's the difference. And that's what often surprises people at Election Day. I think that's why Stephen Harper won re-election in 2008, and again, I guess in 2011, if I got it right? Yes, 2011. It's not that people love Stephen Harper, but they looked at the alternatives and they came to a decision. So I think Kathleen Wynne, like all politicians, has her own set of talents and shortcomings. But I think measured against her competitors, voters found her to be the best choice.
And how do you think she's doing now?
Well, she's at the midterm level now, which is always a very hard time for any government. And she has the privatization of Hydro One as perhaps the most high-profile issue in some parts of the province, not in Toronto, in my opinion, because in this city and in the GTA, we for the most part go through Toronto Hydro or a local hydro outlet in Mississauga, for example. You don't actually interact with Hydro One, so privatizing this remote entity doesn't really get people as excited unless they tend to be more on the left side of the spectrum and don't like privatization of crown corporations. Setting aside Hydro One, I think she's being looked at, and let me just say first that when it comes to provincial politics, despite what the three of us agree on, which is its paramount importance, most people actually don't pay a lot of attention to Queen's Park either between elections. So anything that I would say about how she's doing won't really register with a lot of voters until the next election. I think she's doing okay. I think she generally projects competence. It's a tough question to answer because everyone has very firm opinions of her. I would say that she's well briefed, she's focused, but I think there's always a risk of getting out of touch for politicians, and the longer you're in power, unless you can somehow maintain that connection with voters, you risk alienating people.
Just before we change the subject, just on Kathleen Wynne, you wanted to circle back to her winning the leadership and the obstacles that she overcame at that point. Probably the number one issue was her lifestyle, and that seems to be a total non-issue today, which is great.
It's amazing, but it wasn't back then. And again, we're going to get into a kind of a Canadian political correctness environment where people get very touchy about even raising the subject. But let's go back to 2013 when the leadership was on, or let's go forward to this past month when she was just traveling in India, and there was a lot of coverage in the Indian media about whether she would be snubbed in Amritsar at the site of the Golden Temple.
As a gay woman.
Yeah,
right.
With
her partner there, Jane.
That's right.
Yeah.
And she wasn't snubbed. She was welcomed and received the honors of someone, of a premier representing Ontario. But that reminds us that gay marriage only became legalized a few years ago in this country. I think Liberal delegates at that time, at that leadership convention, whatever biases or prejudices everybody harbors within them, were mostly worried about how the rest of the province would evaluate her. They're, as delegates, they are political animals trying to choose a winner, and I think they were concerned that the rest of the province might be ready, and they were almost psyching themselves out. At the end of the day, they went with her, and I think it became a complete non-issue to everyone's surprise.
Let's change the subject, because we do want to talk about something that's obviously much closer to you personally, and that is the project to retrace and recapture your mother's amazing story. We have a short video clip that accompanied your lengthy account, and you can see it online, but let's roll the clip now that'll introduce us to this story.
My mother was a Holocaust survivor. Helen Adele survived by escaping from Poland after the Nazi invasion and then living under a false identity inside Germany.
I knew I cannot return. That was a terrible feeling. I cannot return. I must not return. That now is the time to go. And I left.
Her parents, my grandparents, were buried in killing fields uncovered over the last decade. Now a memorial has just opened at the mass grave where thousands of Jews like them were slaughtered. It was too late for my mother to attend. She died last year. But I knew that I had to find out more about what happened to the grandparents I never knew. I grew up hearing my mother's story of survival, and now that she's gone, it's time for me to tell her story, my family's story.
Martin, a very compelling story of your mother. She was the only member of her immediate family to get out of Ravaruska before they were all killed by the Nazis. How was she able to escape?
So my mother was only 16 years old at the time, which is something that people often should be reminded of because she was still a teenager. And her parents gathered her together when the Nazis were really closing in. They were already occupying the city, the town, the village, I should say. But there were more actions, more roundups and killings of Jews happening day by day. And so as they could sense the end drawing near, they brought her in one day to the house, introduced her to another Polish Catholic man she'd never seen before. He was the smuggler who was going to arrange to take her out. And they arranged for the two of them to meet later at the train station.
Yeah, the photo we have.
Here's the photo of your mom and her.
Antek was the person who took her out. And they went, she then had to meet him at the station. She went by herself that one evening, took off the Star of David, that's the yellow Star of David patch that the Nazis required all Jews to wear at the time, walked in the darkness to the station, met up with him, no words were exchanged. He couldn't even identify her for risk because of the risks to himself. And from there made it on to a place in Germany, actually, where she spent the war under a false identity that Antek had arranged for her to have as a Polish Catholic girl, and spent the next 2.5 or so years working for a German family, including a Nazi official, until they were liberated by the Russians.
After the war, we're skipping way ahead, but after the war, which she obviously survived, she was able to eventually come to Canada, to Montreal, and start a whole new life, eventually to Toronto. Tell us about her life in Canada. Was it a happy life, or was she always tortured by what she had left and the family she had left behind?
That's a good question, you know. And as the child of a Holocaust survivor, people often ask about that. She was a Holocaust survivor. She ended up, she built a career after raising a family as a psychiatric social worker. And so she has special insights, I think, into the whole psyche of people who survive that kind of life-changing event. She was determined not to burden her children, her family, with that. She wanted us to know about it. She inculcated the details with us, but never tried to make it oppressive or in any way pass on a survivor's guilt. She was always mindful of that. She also, I think that was a motivation for her in her public service as a psychiatric social worker in Montreal, but also in Toronto, what was then Toronto General Hospital. And so I think for her, it was something to always be aware of and to teach her children and to pass on to others without being suffocated by it.
Yeah, and she had a happy life here, and obviously you were inspired to recapture the life that she'd left behind. So thank you for sharing that with us. And we're probably going to have to do another show to be able to get all of that. Just let me ask,
though, did she share a lot of that story with you, or?
She did.
Because many are silent about their war experience.
She was not reluctant.
She wanted that story to be understood, and she actually taped a testimonial about it so that others would know about what happened.
Thank you.
Well, she would have been very proud of how you've captured her story.
And what you've become.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us, Martin, and we'll be back with more Toronto Files after this short break.